This is an ensemble story with multiple strategic architects: Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, Tojo. But the narrative will follow the arc of the alliances themselves as a protagonist, focusing on the critical December 1941 moment when the alliances solidified and the hidden failures of Axis coordination became fatal. You do not win a world war by accident. For centuries, military strategists understood one unshakable truth: the side with the best armies, the most advanced weapons, and the element of surprise wins. Preparation beats improvisation. Professional soldiers beat volunteers. Coordinated first strikes beat desperate alliances formed under fire. By the end of 1941, this rule appeared carved in stone. Germany had the most battle-hardened army on earth. Veterans of Poland, France, the Low Countries, the Balkans. Their generals were Prussian-trained tacticians who'd spent decades studying war. Their tanks rolled across Europe virtually unopposed. Japan commanded the most experienced carrier fleet in the world. Their pilots had logged thousands of combat hours over China. Their admirals had been planning Pacific domination since 1936. Italy possessed the fourth largest navy afloat and colonial holdings across 3 continents. Together, they called themselves the Axis powers. And in December 1941, they controlled more territory than any alliance in human history. Against them stood a fractured collection of nations that, by every military metric, should not have been able to cooperate at all. A capitalist democracy that had barely emerged from the Great Depression. A communist dictatorship that had purged 3/4 of its officer corps. A fading empire bleeding resources to hold scattered colonies. They called themselves the Allied powers, and most military experts gave them 18 months before collapse. But in the final days of 1941, something happened that military historians still debate. The alliance that should have failed found a way to fight together. And the alliance that looked invincible never learned how. This is a story of why the side with better armies lost to the side that barely trusted each other. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland from the west. September 17th, 1939. The Soviet Union invades Poland from the east. Here's what most people forget. For the first 2 years of World War II, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were effectively partners. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact wasn't just a non-aggression treaty. It was a plan to carve up Eastern Europe together. Stalin and Hitler divided Poland like business partners splitting profits. Britain and France declared war on Germany. But they didn't declare war on the Soviet Union, even though Stalin had just grabbed half of Poland. Why? Because in 1939, nobody understood what this war would become. Italy didn't join Germany until June 1940, after France had already fallen. Mussolini waited to see who'd win before picking a side. He declared war on France on June 10th, when Paris was already doomed, hoping to grab territory without fighting. Japan had been waging war in China since 1937, but they weren't formally allied with Germany yet. They were just doing their own thing on the other side of the world. The Tripartite Pact, the document that officially created the Axis powers, wasn't signed until September 27, 1940, more than a year after the war started. Germany, Italy, Japan, 3 nations with 3 separate wars, 3 separate goals, 3 governments that barely communicated. Germany wanted to dominate Europe and destroy the Soviet Union. Italy wanted Mediterranean colonies and respect from Hitler, who privately mocked Mussolini's military. Japan wanted to control Asia and the Pacific, resources from Southeast Asia, and an empire to rival Britain's. They never held joint military planning sessions, never shared intelligence networks, never coordinated their offensives. Meanwhile, the Allies were a mess of contradictions. Britain's Winston Churchill was a die-hard anti-communist who'd spent decades warning about the Soviet threat. Yet by December 1941, he was calling Stalin my friend and shipping weapons to Moscow. America's Franklin Roosevelt led a nation where 80% of citizens wanted nothing to do with Europe's war. The United States was officially neutral. But Roosevelt was already sending destroyers to Britain, arming the Soviets, and choking Japan's oil supply. And Stalin? He trusted nobody. He'd purged 30,000 Red Army officers between 1937 and 1939, executing men for the crime of competence. When British intelligence warned him Germany was about to invade in 1941, he assumed it was a trick to start a war between Germany and Russia. These three powers, capitalist democracy, fading empire, communist dictatorship, had nothing in common except enemies. But they were about to do something the Axis never figured out. They were about to learn how to fight as one. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m., 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border along an 1,800-mile front. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Stalin's Red Army collapses. Entire divisions surrender without firing a shot. German panzers advance 50 miles a day. Within 3 weeks, the Wehrmacht captures 300,000 Soviet prisoners. Hitler expects Moscow to fall by October. But here's what changes everything. Britain immediately offers aid to the Soviet Union, the same Soviet Union that invaded Poland, the same Soviet Union that supplied Germany with oil and grain for 2 years. Churchill goes on BBC Radio and says, "Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. The Russian danger is our danger." Within weeks, British convoys are sailing to Arkhangelsk and Murmansk, delivering tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. It's not charity. It's strategy. Every German division fighting in Russia is one less threatening Britain. December 7th, 1941, 7:48 a.m. Hawaii time. Japanese carrier aircraft strike Pearl Harbor. They sink 4 battleships, damage for more, destroy 188 aircraft. 2,403 Americans die. Japan doesn't declare war first. They just attack. And here's the moment that seals the Axis fate. Germany was informed. Japan's military planners never told Hitler they were about to bring America into the war. The Axis alliance was so dysfunctional that one partner attacked the world's largest industrial power without consulting the others. 4 days later, December 11th, Adolf Hitler declares war on the United States. His own generals are stunned. Germany has no treaty obligation to join Japan's war. Hitler does it anyway, believing America is weak, distracted, too far away to matter. It's the single worst strategic decision of the war, because now the alliance that shouldn't work suddenly has a reason to make it work. December 22nd, 1941, Washington, D.C. Winston Churchill arrives at the White House for the Arcadia Conference. He's flown across the Atlantic in the middle of a war to sit down with Franklin Roosevelt and hammer out a joint strategy. They create something called a Combined Chiefs of Staff, a unified military command structure where American and British generals plan operations together. Not parallel operations, not coordinated operations, the same operations. They agree on Germany first. Defeat Hitler before dealing with Japan, even though Japan just attacked America, even though the Pacific is in flames. They choose the strategic priority together. They decide to share military technology. Everything. Radar, sonar, code breaking, proximity fuses, encrypted communications, even nuclear research. Think about that. 2 nations sharing atomic secrets. Britain gives America cavity magnetron technology, the device that makes radar work. America gives Britain VT fuse specifications. When British scientists crack German Enigma codes at Bletchley Park, they share intercepts with Washington in real time. The Axis never does this. Never. January 1st, 1942, Washington, D.C. 26 nations signed the Declaration by United Nations. It's the first time the term United Nations is used. The signatories pledge to fight together, share resources, and make no separate peace with the Axis. The big 3, America, Britain, Soviet Union, are joined by China, Australia, Canada, India, South Africa, and 19 others. India alone contributes 2.5 million volunteers, the largest volunteer army in human history. Indian soldiers fight in North Africa, Italy, and Burma. They're commanded by British officers, supplied by American factories, coordinating with Soviet intelligence. Meanwhile, what is the Axis doing? Germany launches Operation Barbarossa without telling Japan. Hitler assumed Japan will attack the Soviet Union from the east, forcing Stalin to fight a two-front war. Instead, Japan signs a neutrality pact with the Soviets and attacks America. Japan conquers Southeast Asia, seizing rubber, oil, and tin. Germany desperately needs these resources for the war in Russia. Japan never shares them. Not one barrel of oil flows from Japanese-occupied Indonesia to German-occupied Europe. Italy invades Greece in October 1940 without consulting Hitler. The invasion is a disaster. Greek forces push the Italians back into Albania. Mussolini loses 13,000 men in 3 weeks. Hitler has to bail him out. German divisions that were supposed to prepare for Barbarossa get diverted to Greece and Yugoslavia. The Balkans campaign delays the invasion of Russia by 5 critical weeks. Those 5 weeks matter. The Wehrmacht reaches the outskirts of Moscow in early December 1941, just as winter hits. If Barbarossa had launched in May instead of June, German troops might have taken Moscow before the snow fell. Military historians still debate whether 5 weeks would have changed the war. But here's what's certain. Hitler's decision to rescue Mussolini caused Germany its best chance at defeating the Soviet Union. And Mussolini never asked for help. Hitler intervened because he couldn't afford to let his ally collapse. That's not cooperation. That's damage control. August 1942. The Solomon Islands. American Marines land on Guadalcanal. It's the first major offensive against Japan. The battle turns into a 6-month meat grinder. Japan loses 31,000 men. America loses 7,000. But here's what makes it different. American forces are supplied by a logistics network spanning 5,000 miles. Ships built in California, loaded in Hawaii, escorted by Australian destroyers, guided by intelligence from code breakers in Washington and Pearl Harbor. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal fights with extraordinary courage. But Tokyo can't keep them supplied. The Imperial Navy loses control of the sea around the island. Japanese soldiers starve. Why? Because Japan's military and navy don't coordinate. The army wants to defend the Philippines. The navy wants to hold the Solomons. They argue over resource allocation while their men die. The Allies have the same arguments, but they resolve them. Roosevelt and Churchill meet 9 times during the war. 9 face-to-face conferences. They argue bitterly over strategy. Churchill wants to invade southern Europe. Roosevelt wants a cross-channel attack into France. But they decide together. And once they decide, both nations commit. Stalin never attends a conference outside Soviet territory, but he sends representatives to Cairo and Tehran. Soviet intelligence shares reports on German troop movements. When the Allies plan D-Day, they coordinate the timing with a Soviet offensive in the east, Operation Bag Ration, to prevent Germany from moving reinforcements west. The Axis never coordinates like this. Never. November 1942. Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army is encircled. 250,000 men trapped in a frozen city. Hitler orders them to fight to the last man. He expects Italy, Romania, and Hungary, Germany's supposed allies, to send relief forces. The Romanian Third Army collapses in 3 days. Hungarian units retreat without engaging. Italian divisions on the Don River disintegrate. Why? Because these nations were never true partners. They were coerced allies fighting Germany's war, not their own. When the Sixth Army surrenders in February 1943, it's the first time an entire German field army has capitulated. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility dies in the Stalingrad snow. If you find this kind of forgotten history as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of strategy and sacrifice deserve to be told. And by subscribing, you help us ensure they aren't forgotten. July 1943. Sicily. Allied forces land on Italian soil. It's the first invasion of Axis home territory. 160,000 troops, American, British, Canadian, stormed the beaches in a coordinated assault planned at the Casablanca Conference 6 months earlier. Within weeks, Italy collapses. Mussolini is deposed on July 25th. The new Italian government signs an armistice with the Allies on September 3rd. Then Italy does something extraordinary. It switches sides. On October 13, 1943, Italy declares war on Germany. Italian soldiers who'd fought for the Axis now fight against it. They're not treated as full allies. Britain and America list them as co-belligerents, but they provide intelligence, harbor saboteurs, and tie down German divisions occupying Italy. The Axis alliance literally tears itself apart. Germany has to divert divisions from the Eastern Front in France to occupy Italy and disarm Italian troops. Hitler loses an ally and gains an occupation zone. It's a strategic nightmare that happens when your alliance is built on coercion instead of shared purpose. June 6, 1944. Normandy. 156,000 Allied troops land in France. It's the largest amphibious invasion in history. American, British, Canadian, Free French, Polish, and Czech forces stormed 5 beaches under a single unified command structure led by General Dwight Eisenhower. The planning took 18 months. Officers from 9 nations coordinated logistics, intelligence, air support, and naval bombardment. They rehearsed together. They shared supply lines. They agreed on objectives. Eisenhower commands British field marshals. British Admiral Bertram Ramsay commands American ships. It's the most integrated military command in history. Meanwhile, Germany's response is paralyzed by confusion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wants to defend at the beaches. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt wants to hold panzers inland for counterattack. They argue for hours on June 6, while Allied troops consolidate beachheads. Hitler, sleeping at Berchtesgaden, is informed until noon. Nobody can authorize moving panzer reserves without his approval. The German command structure is so fractured, so dependent on Hitler's personal authority, that junior officers are terrified to make decisions. Precious hours evaporate while the Allies pour reinforcements ashore. The Eastern Front is bleeding Germany dry. 200,000 casualties a month. But there's no coordination with the West. Germany fights 2 separate wars, shifting divisions from crisis to crisis, never able to concentrate forces because the Allies attack from multiple directions simultaneously. This is the fruit of alliance integration. When the Soviets launch Operation Bag Ration on June 23rd, just 17 days after D-Day, Germany cannot reinforce both fronts. 28 German divisions are annihilated in Belarus, while panzers are locked in battle around Cannes. Stalin times his offensive precisely to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. That's coordination. That's alliance warfare. The Axis never learned how to do it. By the summer of 1944, the strategic consequences of alliance integration are undeniable. Allied factories operate as a single industrial system. American shipyards build Liberty ships in 42 days, fast enough to replace losses faster than German U-boats can sink them. British factories produce Merlin engines. Canadian factories assemble Lancaster bombers using American aluminum and British designs. The Soviet T-34 tank runs on American trucks, carrying American fuel, refined from American oil. When Soviet factories evacuate east of the Urals in 1941, they rebuild using American machine tools shipped through Lend-Lease. $14 billion in American aid flows to the Soviet Union, 400,000 trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, 11,000 aircraft, 15 million pairs of boots. Soviet generals later admit, without American logistics, the Red Army couldn't have sustained offensives deep into Eastern Europe. This isn't charity. It's integrated warfare. America produces, Russia bleeds, Britain coordinates. The Axis has no equivalent system. Japan captures British Malaysia and Dutch Indonesia, the richest rubber and oil fields in Asia. Germany's synthetic fuel plants are being bombed to rubble. A resource-sharing arrangement could save the Wehrmacht's mechanized divisions. But Japanese oil never reaches Europe. Not one tanker. The distances are too great, Allied submarines too effective, and more fundamentally, nobody in Tokyo or Berlin ever creates a system to make it happen. Germany and Japan never establish a secure communication link. Messages go by submarine or through neutral countries, taking weeks. When Germany develops the V2 rocket, Japan doesn't learn the details until after the war. When Japan cracks American merchant ship codes, Germany isn't informed. This is insanity. These are supposed to be military allies. Meanwhile, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park share ultra-intelligence with Washington within hours. When German U-boats receive new patrol coordinates, Allied convoy commanders know before the submarines do. The Allies create combined bomber offensive in 1943. American B-17s bomb Germany by day. British Lancasters by night. German cities burn around the clock. Factories operate in shifts to rebuild during darkness, except there is no darkness anymore. The bombing never stops. This is what integrated air power looks like. Two air forces, different doctrines, different aircraft, but coordinated timing to achieve maximum destruction. Germany and Japan never coordinate air strategy. Not once. February 1945. Yalta. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin meet in the Crimean Palace to plan the post-war world. They're dividing Germany before Germany has even surrendered. They're coordinating the final offensives. They're establishing occupation zones, voting procedures for the United Nations, and a framework for trials of war criminals. Think about what this represents. Three leaders who distrust each other intensely, planning not just victory, but the peace that follows. The Axis never holds this meeting. Hitler and Mussolini meet occasionally, but only to argue. Hitler and Tojo never meet, not once during the entire war. The Axis alliance exists on paper, but not in practice. And this is why they lose. Not because their soldiers lack courage. German and Japanese troops fight with extraordinary tenacity until the bitter end, not because their weapons are inferior. The German Tiger tank and Japanese Zero fighter are world-class designs. They lose because an alliance that fights three separate wars cannot defeat an alliance that fights one war on three fronts. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The Third Reich, which Hitler boasted would last 1,000 years, collapses after 12. Berlin is rubble. German cities are smoking ruins. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared army on earth, ceases to exist. September 2nd, 1945. Japan surrenders aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The empire that controlled Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and much of China surrenders after atomic bombs destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito tells his people in a radio address they must endure the unendurable. The Axis powers are defeated utterly. But the Allied victory comes at a cost almost impossible to comprehend. 24 million Soviet soldiers and civilians dead. 450,000 American soldiers killed. 383,000 British soldiers and civilians lost. 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Millions more in China, Poland, Yugoslavia, the Philippines. The war kills 70 to 85 million people worldwide. 3% of Earth's population. And here's what makes the Allied victory remarkable. The alliance holds together long enough to win, then immediately fractures. By 1947, Churchill is giving his Iron Curtain speech, warning that the Soviet Union now threatens Europe. The alliance that defeated Hitler becomes a Cold War that defines the next 50 years. But for 4 years, 1941 to 1945, nations that had nothing in common except enemies learned to share intelligence, coordinate strategy, and build weapons together. They proved that an alliance built on necessity, maintained through constant negotiation, and executed with integrated command structures, can defeat opponents with superior armies. The lesson is simple but profound. Cooperation beats capability. The side that learns to fight together beats the side that fights alone. This is why NATO still exists, why the United Nations was created, why military alliances now emphasize interoperability, joint exercises, and shared logistics networks. The architects of the Allied victory understood something the Axis never grasped. Modern war is too complex for any nation to win alone. The Axis powers had the advantage in 1941. Better trained armies, recent combat experience, the initiative of surprise attacks, and control of vast territories. They lost because they never built a true alliance. Germany, Italy, and Japan each fought their own war with their own goals, barely communicating, never coordinating. They signed a treaty but never created a partnership. The Allies, capitalist America, communist Russia, colonial Britain, had every reason to distrust each other. They argued constantly. Churchill and Stalin despised each other's political systems. Roosevelt had to navigate between them like a mediator, but they made it work. They created unified commands. They shared technology. They synchronized offensives. They built supply networks that spanned oceans and continents. And when the war ended, they had proven that an alliance of necessity could defeat an alliance of convenience. The men who fought in this war, American GIs in Europe, British soldiers in North Africa, Soviet troops at Stalingrad, Indian volunteers in Burma, Canadian pilots over Germany. They didn't fight because they understood grand strategy. They fought for the men beside them, for their nations, for survival. But their leaders gave them something the Axis never provided, a strategy that made their sacrifices count toward common victory instead of 3 separate defeats. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm this piece of history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to rescuing these forgotten stories from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state. And tell us if someone in your family served in World War II. These stories connect us across generations. Thank you for ensuring that the alliance that saved the world, imperfect, fractious, but ultimately united, is not forgotten. They fought together so we could live free.